Thank you. Thank you kindly for the wonderful introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? The mic is on. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a great honor. Thank you all for getting up very early. You've had a very busy couple of days, and I, as I understand, did a wonderful time last night. So I appreciate you getting to your coffee this morning in time in order to come out. So what I'm going to do is to talk for a couple of minutes this morning about trade policy. And as mentioned, I work at the World Bank, but I do research at the World Bank. So I'm not a policymaker at the World Bank. So what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is how trade economists and analysts are thinking about some of the current policy issues and sets of negotiations issues that are confronting the world right now, whether we're talking about the United States, Europe, the emerging markets, the developing world, etc. But I'm very much going to do so from a research perspective, and these remarks are going to be purely my own, so they won't represent the World Bank, its executive directors, or any of the countries or governments for which they represent. So just to be clear, this is not World Bank policy, this is CHAD. Okay, 21st century trade policy and international economic cooperation. So to start, I think we should begin by looking back a little bit and thinking about a little of economic history and thinking about what trade negotiators did in the past, at least as it relates to today. And so what I have in mind is if we start to think about the current system and the current questions that confront us and the current state of the world, the current institutional infrastructure that we have today, we need to understand how we got there. And to understand how we got there really takes us back to 1929, 1930. In the United States, we had the stock market crash of 1929, the onset of the Great Depression, the legislation that was signed into law, what became known as the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, and then the international response to that, by which the United States' key trading partners, because they were shut out of the U.S. market with these exorbitantly high U.S. tariffs, responded in kind, and we're left with this downward spiral, this spider web of declining international trade flows, so that by 1933, we're essentially, for all intents and purposes, in autarky. Autarky, basically closed economy. Not much trade left anymore between the major economies of the world. So that obviously we know what happens after that. World War II, a long period before World War II of in the United States economic depression, but that's really our starting point. Starting from a really closed economic system and trying to think about designing a new institutional infrastructure at the end of the Second World War, which would prevent a lot of those same mistakes in the realm of international trade policy and cooperation from being repeated. So what has subsequently happened over the last 70 years or so is we've had trade agreements. I would argue that the most important of these, certainly institutionally, but also I think systemically, has been the establishment of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, in 1947, so right at the end of the Second World War, which then subsequently evolved into the WTO. So the GATT was, 23 countries got together at the end under the sort of Bretton Woods framework that also established the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. The third pillar of that was designed to be another international organization called the ITO. It was never kicked off because it could not get passed through Congress, but in its stead gave rise to this trade agreement, a legal document at least, establishing a system by which there would be rules and principles and a framework to negotiate multilateral, non-discriminatory tariff reductions between willing and able countries. And that's a system that we still now live under today. The WTO system is very much a reflection and a historical continuation beyond that process, which began in the late 1940s. Along the way, of course, you had lots and lots of other trade agreements that came up. And so there are lots of examples of preferential trade agreements. So the most famous of which, of course, is now the European Union, which started off in the 1950s under originally the Steel Agreement and then the Treaty of Rome, and ultimately expanded to move well beyond trade integration, but integration of a political sort, an economic and monetary union among subsets of countries as well. But then there's lots of other examples of preferential trade agreements, NAFTA, and then there's of course huge waves of new trade agreements that are, or preferential trade agreements being undertaken today. And then even in that same period as well, you have some countries that, while perhaps foot dragging a little bit when it came to preferential agreements with other partners or the multilateral system, nevertheless chose to open their economies unilaterally. So the first question then is, well, maybe the job of trade negotiators, as we currently understood it, at least with the fundamental problems that existed, due to what was going on in the 1930s, end of the Second World War in 1945, maybe their job is done. So their initial job was to cut tariffs, to get together in these negotiating rounds and have countries, each other, policymakers, cut their border tariffs, their import taxes. That all they do is they tax stuff coming in. They're an additional tax that gets imposed on a good that's produced in a different country. So now if we look at the data, so in the slide I have up there, and I'm going to put a number of charts and figures up there, and you're not going to be able to see them, and this is the standard economist trick. I'm either going to show things that are going up or going down, and you're going to say, oh yes, that looks very important, or I'm going to put numbers up there that are much too small for you to actually see, but you're going to nod your head and say, yes, those look like very, very important numbers, even though you can't see them. It's all by design of the economist. So what these two small numbers are that you can't see is that actually tariffs now are really low, right? In the US, the tariffs that are applied are on the order of 3% to other WTO countries. In the EU, they're 5%. So maybe the story is there's just not a lot there to negotiate over anymore, and the job of trade policy negotiators is done, and we don't need to worry about these trade agreement things anymore. So that's one potential story, but then we look at the data for other countries that aren't necessarily the high-income countries. So here, these are the emerging economies in the group of 20, in the G20. And for them, their tariffs are definitely lower than they have been historically. These are at historically low levels for these countries. But for a number of them, they're still relatively high. So the US, EU, 3 to 5%. India, almost 14%. Brazil, 13, 14%. Argentina, China, 10%. Russia, who just got into the WTO, 10%. Turkey, 10%. So arguably, there's still some tariff cutting work to be done, eliminating some of these just policy barriers at the border that governments impose, even for the highly emerging markets. And then if we move beyond those to more lower income countries, the tariff story there's a lot more work to be done, right? Tariffs there are a bit higher, much higher. Now, some of that may be for revenue-raising purposes, et cetera, but some of that still has to be dealt with, right? Arguably, the using border instruments like tariffs is not the most efficient way for fiscal authorities to necessarily raise money over the long term. So there's still tariff-cutting work to be done. And even in this multilateral system, yes, the WTO seems to be nearly universal and comprehensive, 160 member countries now. But when we look at the details, there's still 500 million people that are not in countries that are members of the WTO and that don't enjoy even the basic benefits of membership that the WTO provides. Okay, but the story is overall, this GATT and WTO, the multilateral framework, has done an effective job over the last 70 years. For the countries that have actively engaged, especially through the reciprocal negotiations, I'll lower my tariffs on trucks if you lower your tariffs toward me on exports of steel, things like that. These reciprocal trade-offs have provided a very effective means for which countries have been able to lower and sustain these lower import tariffs over time. But there's still work to be done for some countries. Well, but then you might say, if you even buy the argument that maybe for the US, Europe, et cetera, that this tariff cutting work is done, maybe what that would mean is we don't really need trade negotiators anymore. We don't need the US Trade Representative's office. We don't need, in the Commission, DG Trade and as such. Should these trade negotiators and then trade economists, people like me, become extinct? Luckily, the answer is no, at least luckily for me. Because Because even if we did get rid of tariffs so they were cut down to zero, it's just not the end of the story. There's lots of other barriers out there and in forms of international cooperation that we really need to begin to think about and to understand. And as I'll get to in a moment, this is really what the crux of, for example, the negotiations today in the TTIP are about. So the trade agreement negotiations currently ongoing between the US and Europe. Right, and there's a great quote up there by the economist Robert Baldwin, who was one of my graduate school advisors way back, in 45 years ago, in 1970. The lowering of tariffs, even at that point in time, has been in effect like draining a swamp. The lower water level has revealed all the snags and stumps of non-tariff barriers that still have to be cleared away. So there's still a lot of work for trade negotiators to do, and economists and scholars and researchers to help advise them on in understanding. And that's what's going on today, right? So a lot of these negotiations, these mega regional trade agreements that you might have heard about, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, between the US and Europe, the simultaneous negotiations that the United States is undertaking right now with Japan and a major bloc of countries in Asia, the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. And then separately, this regional comprehensive economic partnership set of negotiations taking place between China and another set, or some overlapping sets of countries in Asia there. And then, of course, you also have the WTO Doha round that's still ongoing as well. So a lot of potential competing trade agreement negotiations take place. Some countries negotiating multiple deals at the same time with different groups of countries. But a lot of this moving beyond tariffs to other stuff. Right? So what is it that trade policymakers do today? Yeah, there's some tariffs that they're still trying to cut, but they have to think really hard about making sure that they create a system that can maintain those low tariffs too. Because it's not as if the political pressure, especially in times of crisis, as I'll show you in a moment, has eliminated the possibility that government policymakers would like to step in and impose new trade restrictions. It still happened during the crisis. So we need to make sure that as we open up and liberalize, that we create a system that's relatively flexible that can withstand difficult, complicated shocks that occur. And then also create the institutions and infrastructure to deal with disputes that will inevitably arise as well, that won't allow the entire institutional infrastructure to crumble if there's a bilateral spat between a couple of the major players over some kind of sensitive products. Right? And I'll talk about that in a moment as well. And we know lots of examples between the US and Europe, whether we're thinking about bananas or beef hormones or GMOs or Boeing, Airbus or things like that. Right? But also, there's this issue of negotiating deeper cooperation in trade agreements, right? That potentially addresses new challenges to the system. And the deeper cooperation, these are things like buzzwords that you may have heard about. Well, there's the standards issue, labor standards, environmental standards, investment, intellectual property rights protection, data protection, perhaps you're thinking about privacy protection. But also buzzwords like regulatory coherence, right? What are going to be the impacts? How should we think about regulators that are dealing with domestic constituencies' concerns and getting those to be, to have regulators in one country think about the potential implications for firms that are involved in the global economy, but also what the regulators in other countries are thinking about as well, and how do we deal with that? Okay, so what I'm going to do over the next couple of minutes is provide a roadmap for what some of the performance has been under the main, I would say, motivations for why trade agreements exist and why they're out there. So one, is there a forum for countries to get together and negotiate liberalization, right? Whether it's tariffs, rules for how we're going to treat each other, how we're going to negotiate reciprocally. We're going to not discriminate against other members, so we're going to have sort of equal treatment provisions. But also the exceptions to those rules and when they can possibly be triggered, when you're allowed to violate the standard set of rules, what sorts of conditions are necessary for that and whether they're used. The role that trade agreements play in offering up transparency and what the benefits of that potentially are, and especially in times of crisis. And then how they can also create for disputes and bilateral frictions to get resolved as well in their performance. All right, so we already talked about the forum for negotiations and how, according to some metrics and for some countries, they've been relatively successful. In other areas, at least as we're thinking about tariffs, there's room to work and to go. But what these trade agreements have also established is the rules for exceptions. So the conditions under which, if I have an industry or a set of products that firms in my economy produce, and they're injured by import competition, when we can momentarily pause and stop those imports from coming in temporarily in order to give those firms some time to adjust, right? But to have the limits of that new protection, the new trade barriers, be very well defined. So they're only temporary, and they're limited to a specific set of products. So policies like anti-dumping, countervailing duties, and safeguards, as the introduction mentioned, this was a database that I had built a long time ago, and we've continued to update and maintain since then. But the first question that comes up is, so we collectively call these things temporary trade barriers because they are supposed to be limited in duration. You're allowed to impose them under certain conditions, but they're only supposed to be temporary. So the first question is, are these things being used, and in what sorts of magnitudes, and is this important? And the answer is, yeah, they're being used. I'll show you more evidence on that. But right now, they're being used in particularly interesting sectors, right? Sectors where, if we're thinking about climate change in particular, or renewable energy, right, or pollution sorts of issues, we might like to have freer trade. So we could have cheaper access to green, clean technology that might shift us away from fossil fuel-based energy sources. So we can see, I put a list up there, a number of instances in which countries all over the world have used these exceptions. So they may have low border tariffs on these products, solar panels, wind towers, the polysilicon that goes into the formation of these panels, solar cells, biodiesel, where you might want to have freer trade in some of these products, and you might have low tariffs. Nevertheless, governments are still finding ways to restrict trade in these products through use of these particular exceptions. So this is a story that just lowering tariffs is not enough. If you're a trade policy negotiators, you have to have the institutions and the watchful eyes to make sure that the tariff cuts that you make actually are sustainable over the long run and aren't eroded through these other kinds of trade barriers that can come along. And as we've seen, this is one of those charts where things are going down and things are going up. The thing that's going down is tariffs. So average tariffs have been going down over the last 15 years, but what has been going up during that time period is governments resort to these other non-tariff barriers to trade, the anti-dumping and the safeguards, some of which are just offsetting the tariff liberalization, the import tariffs cuts, with these new forms of protection, right? So we have to be thinking about both of these things. The exceptions are no longer exceptional, right? They're being increasingly used. And this is just data to show you that lots of countries, the biggest users of these kinds of exceptions, it's not just the US and Europe anymore, but it's a lot of these emerging markets. It's the India, Turkey, China, Argentina, Brazil, right? As they're cutting their tariffs historically, they're starting to resort to these new trade barriers as well. These things are all related. All right, what else do trade agreements potentially provide to us? Arguably, transparency, and in times of crisis. So I have a book out on this recently, so this session is a huge self-promotion endeavor as well. So this is a book that we put together after the crisis. Basically, just to recap with the crisis, though, summer of 2008, all of a sudden it occurs to everybody, whoa, we're in the midst of something big, right? So this is just a picture of changes in quarterly changes in GDP for the G20 economies. And you can see beginning in the third quarter of 2008 for virtually everybody, right? We just go into a simultaneous, almost global recession. Previously, just never heard of, but potentially quite similar to what we saw back in the Great Depression. Even in the the high growth emerging markets of China and India, the bottom right column up there, you still see a tremendous reduction in growth from previous quarters. And at the same time, you have the collapse of global trade flows as well, right? Not only is GDP, economic growth collapsing, but you have international trade flows collapsing. And the world had no idea what was going on. Was it like the 1930s? Had somebody implemented trade restrictions and just nobody had noticed, right? Well, what trade agreements can do, and what we do today much better than what we did 70 years ago, is we now have reporting requirements and frameworks and information flows that allow us to track much more quickly what governments around the world are doing in terms of their policies. And so there was an announcement of the G20, of the first and foremost most important one. We underscore the critical importance of rejecting protectionism and not turning inward in times of financial uncertainty. Okay? So the idea is the G20 recognized this is an important issue for them. The public did as well. So this is a plot of Google searches, and you can do now in Google Trends for terms like Great Depression. Now in October of 2008, you see a spike. The general public is hearing Great Depression, 1930s. What's that all about? And so, I don't know. People are Wikipediaing it, figuring out what's going on. Protectionism in February 2009, they're hearing about this from their leaders and in the media as well. What is this all about, and is it happening? So what these international organizations in the multilateral system can do is to provide public goods, such as monitoring. And this is what I was heavily involved with during the crisis, as were others at the WTO through the Trade Policy Review Body, this independent entity called the Global Trade Alert, and we put out this thing called now the Temporary Trade Barriers Database. And we can provide information on what countries are doing with their trade policies because of reporting requirements and the institutional infrastructure that the multilateral system has imposed on countries. So what we did is we did that. Every quarter, we provided an update to the world of what the data was in terms of the policy actions that governments had been taking over the last 3 months. And this previously hadn't been done before, but it was really, really important to policymakers to get a sense of what was going on. And so we did this, and other entities as well did this. We put out monitoring reports, we wrote op-eds, try to just make clear to the system what was happening, but also what wasn't happening, right? That this wasn't like the 1930s again. Yes, governments were intervening with trade policy, but a lot of that was normal. This was through anti-dumping, safeguards, etc. But these are the kinds of policies that in this new era, governments use in times of crisis, and it's not like the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930, right? So that we all shouldn't overreact. Policymakers shouldn't overreact when they see that somebody has just imposed an anti-dumping measure. Transparency. And as a result, I'm not saying that this was due to what we did, but it's observationally equivalent at least. The macro economy around the world, for the most part, stabilized. Right, we got through the worst depths of the crisis, and I understand here in Europe it's been still a slow slog, but things recovered much better than I think a lot of people feared at that particular moment in time, and trade, for the most part, recovered as well, or at least a good chunk of it did, toward a V-shaped trade recovery. The third piece of what these international institutions do is they provide, or they have the potential to provide, for the settlement of disputes. So what trade negotiators, trade policymakers, and trade analysts focus on as well is thinking about the frictions that arise between countries and trying to limit the damage of those frictions. So the typical dispute that we observe out there involves a government offering too much trade protection, trying to protect a domestic industry. Right? Going above and beyond the limits of assistance that it had promised its trading partners out there that it would provide. And this is a collective action story. We all come into this trade agreement. We all agree to limit the amount of assistance that we're going to give to our private sectors. And when somebody sort of breaks the rules, the dispute settlement system can provide a check against that to kind of bring everybody back into line. So here are the examples of the famous or infamous disputes that we've probably all heard of between the US and Europe on the banana case, beef hormones, steel safeguards, etc. Some of the more recent ones, you'll see a lot of the new emerging economies, a lot of developing countries are now involved in the dispute settlement system. The WTO is 160 member countries. Lots of disputes, not so much between, including the least and the poorest developing countries, but part of that is they don't trade a whole lot. But it is actively used by the middle income in the emerging markets. Russia, as soon as they got in, started to face disputes. So if you think about how you'd like to have confrontations between countries out there in the system, would you like to have it in a legal forum with well-defined rules where if you're found to have done something wrong, you're asked to get rid of that policy that was wrong, and if not, the trading partner that was hurt by that, they're allowed to retaliate, but it's not an unlimited retaliation. It's a limited retaliation. It's taking back equivalently from them what they took away from you in the first place through trade policy, through tariffs, right? It's a system that keeps problems contained legally. That's how it's designed. Pakistan, India, Indonesia, Colombia, Peru, Ukraine, Moldova, lots of new members in the WTO, the multilateral system, already actively engaging its dispute settlement offices to resolve bilateral frictions. Why is this important? Maintains open markets, maintains a rules-based. There was a system before the WTO came into effect in 1995 that helped to resolve disputes, but it was very different. It was a political-based system. It was a diplomatic-based system, in which case power ruled much more than the rule of law. Now, even tiny countries can bring disputes if you want. There's no veto power by the big players. There's legal assistance centers set up to help poor countries pursue their rights, to help put public pressure on richer countries if they're imposing policies that are in violation of what the general rules are and that are hurting other countries out there. And as I mentioned, also it helps to contain the fallout when frictions inevitably arise. Now at the World Bank, this is very important because the disputes that come out of these cases, they have implications for our clients, right? On one hand, if you're told as a government that you've got to change a policy because it's in violation of the rules, as soon as you change that policy, that's going to impact trade flows. And that's going to impact exporters or importers or the workers at these companies that makes what's being traded, right? They need to know their trade flows, that their livelihoods are about to be affected by trade policy changes. It also affects their access to policy space. It establishes jurisprudence that says this kind of policy, not okay. And if you're the country that employs that kind of policy, you need to know that, right? Or else you could be subject to a similar kinds of dispute. So at the World Bank, we're confronted with kind of keeping up with this aspect of the system as well. All right, so what I want to conclude with today is the question that's confronting us currently. So that was kind of a historical presentation of what the current multilateral system is, how it evolved over time, how it's been used, what its role is, what its performance is according to a number of different metrics, liberalization of tariffs, transparency that it has provided in times of crisis, access to a place for countries to resolve disputes peacefully, right? These bilateral trade disputes, to my knowledge, haven't turned into war, right? They get resolved. They don't always get resolved by the policy getting reversed. Sometimes there's a period in which we agree to disagree and I get to retaliate against you for thinking about the US-EU with beef hormones, but the fallout is limited, right? But what should these negotiators be thinking about as they're pushing forward? So this draws from a recent paper that I've been thinking about with a couple of other scholars at Stanford and Dartmouth, and especially in the context of what the negotiators are negotiating currently under the TTIP negotiations in TPP. So PTA here is preferential trade agreements, these mega regional agreements, and thinking about this relative to the WTO multilateral system. And asking, is the WTO passé? Maybe the WTO is done. We should just say, thanks, you did your job, we're moving on. Right? That's what we're trying to think about in this paper. Historically, the WTO has taken a very shallow integration approach to negotiators. Negotiators have gotten together and they've negotiated, but primarily just over setting up the institution, setting up transparency rules and rules for how we're going to treat each other, but then just limiting the negotiating scope to thinking about border barriers, tariffs. These new trade agreement negotiations are about something else entirely. As we saw, between the US and Europe, there's not a lot of tariffs to negotiate over. So now we're thinking about deep integration, deep cooperation over regulatory standards, investment provisions, right? Investor state, right? The biggest flashpoint so far in the negotiations, at least public flashpoint in the negotiations, which inevitably is going to mean new institutions. So what are the records on these things? Some of it you've already seen on the WTO side, so I won't repeat that again. It's relatively good. How about on the PTA side, on the preferential trade agreement side? So how effective have they been when going deeper to do more than the multilateral system has been able to accomplish? So, and that's one argument for why preferential trade agreements might be good, right? So the multilateral system sort of stalls, but there are certain countries out there that want to do more. So can they use these other vehicles to do more? The record on doing more under preferential agreements, these mega regionals that we're thinking about today fall under this category, are mixed. Even when it comes to the simple aspect of tariff setting, tariff cutting, yeah, tariff cutting has been very effective between EU member states, right? There's basically free trade now between all the member states of the EU. So that's been fantastic. But in all the other FTAs around the world, it hasn't been as always a rosy story, right? So there are politically sensitive sectors in all countries, and some of the arguments might be, well, maybe these preferential trade agreements can help lower those preferential tariffs and or these tariffs in politically sensitive sectors preferentially. So if we're thinking about agriculture, right, or certain textiles or something where there might be strong political interests or labor interests, something like that. When you look at the data, it's not clear that preferential agreements have been any more effective at reducing the hardest to reach. Like if there are these tariffs like right on your back that are really hard to reach to get them lower, it's not clear that they've been any more effective at reaching those tariffs and cutting those tariffs than multilateral negotiations, right? The evidence isn't clear on that. We also know from economic analysis that setting preferential tariffs is not as good as setting lowering non-discriminatory tariffs, because you can have economic distortions that come about. You might start importing more, yes, from a trading partner that you have a preferential agreement with, but that may not be the most efficient thing. That may not be the lowest cost supplier of the good. You might not be importing any more from the best producers of the good, the highest quality producers of the good out there somewhere else in the world, this thing called trade diversion. And we have evidence that sometimes that can happen as well, right? And then finally, there's an old economic analysis of whether these preferential agreements, the discriminatory agreements between just sets of countries, are building blocks, so they help us get to a more open and non-discriminatory multilateral system, or whether they're building blocks or whether they're stumbling blocks, and they create new barriers that make it even more difficult for us to get toward multilateral cooperation down the line. Right? And the evidence there can go either way, we've found. In certain instances, it looks like building blocks. In others, it looks like stumbling blocks. The red light mean I'm close to being done or I'm about done? So that's the confrontation where we are today. Right? The deep integration approach is let's go much beyond tariff cutting and thinking about regulatory standards and direct negotiations over regulatory policies. And just to conclude, it's not clear from an economist's perspective of whether that's the right thing to do. We don't really know what these negotiators are negotiating about. We haven't yet analyzed it. And economists are always hesitant to provide policy advice until we're absolutely sure. And we have a lot of questions before we can be absolutely sure as to what this is going to mean in practice and in reality. So it's very exciting times that we live in, but there's still a lot of uncertainty out there. In any case, I'll stop there. Thank you.